Dr. Lucas Morel, the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics at Washington and Lee University, joined the Academic Freedom Alliance when it was founded in 2021. His publishing has been focused on Abraham Lincoln and Ralph Ellison, but he easily summons close readings of founding documents and the Revolutionary period. More than anything, Morel has a specific point of view when it comes to debate, saying, quote, "When you form an opinion, make it a fair fight." I'm Dave Cantor, and this is the best of our knowledge. A few points of clarification ahead of the show. Morel says that during 2020, a statue of Frederick Douglass in Rochester, New York, was pulled down as he works to point out the hypocrisy of uprisings around the country that summer. There's an assumption made here that the people or a group of people responsible for the monument's destruction are tied to left-wing politics and sprung to action following the killing of George Floyd. That Douglass statue actually had previously been vandalized several times, according to the Democrat and Chronicle, a daily newspaper in Rochester. The first incident was back in 2018, and to date, no one's taken credit for the 2020 defacement, and Rochester police have not made arrests. There's also a moment that Morel, while discussing divisions among Americans, mentions abortion and the recently leaked Supreme Court draft opinion. He says that until recently, the medical procedure was accessible, quote, up until the actual birth. Most states have a cutoff point of fetal viability, which doesn't actually have a strict definition. But in most cases, apart from situations where the mother's health is in danger, abortion restrictions begin at or near the beginning of the third trimester. All of this is to say that the views expressed by the guests of the show are solely their own. They do not reflect the views of the host, me, the station, or its management. You are Dr. Lucas Morel, the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the department at Washington and Lee in Virginia. You're also a member of the Academic Freedom Alliance's Academic Committee. So I guess first tell me the goals of the Academic Freedom Alliance and if there was a specific instance that led you to become affiliated with the group or kind of a kind of encounter that you'd repeatedly had.
Okay. The Academic Freedom Alliance exists as a nonprofit network of diverse faculty, diverse disciplines, diverse political persuasions. We both have current professors as well as emeriti. And we exist for one reason, which is in a way just to keep colleges and universities in the United States faithful to their truth-seeking mission, that universities exist for the pursuit of knowledge. And what's essential, not plan B or optional, but what's essential to that is freedom of inquiry, freedom of discussion, freedom of the sorts of questions you want to ask, and even the answers that you come to. We're not content-based. We're not viewpoint. We don't discriminate based on viewpoint. And so both for the sake of academic freedom, as well as First Amendment free speech rights of university professors principally, but also other employees, we want to make sure that universities uphold their own mission. And if we're doing our job well, which helps universities do their job well, we should be out of business in a few years. But unfortunately, it doesn't look like the pendulum is swinging back yet. So what we do that distinguishes us from similar organizations like FIRE, which is not just call attention publicly to the ways universities are not defending individual faculty's rights is we also have a legal advisory council, and we raise money so that we can, if a faculty member chooses, defend faculty against the immense resources that administrations can bring against them for them just doing their jobs as faculty. I was brought into this because I knew some of the other kind of original present at the creation members like Keith Whittington and Robbie George at Princeton, Donald Downs, and others. For example, Nadine Strassel is on our or is a part of the AFA, among others. So I'm involved because I see too much happening that is undermining the, as I say, the truth-seeking mission of what I would think is most, if not all, American colleges and universities.
So the organization, I believe, was founded in March 2021. Why then?
I think it was brewing for about a year or so before that. But the key thing was to try to say to ourselves, well, what are we going to bring to the table, again, that FIRE or Heterodox Academy isn't already doing? And these are organizations that we, of course, fully support in terms of their own missions. But I think it was seeing if we could raise the money to make our words count. So it's not just another press release or another ignored statement that's issued to some dean or provost or president. We wanted to make a splash in saying, not only do we believe these things, but we're willing to go to court over them. And so this was something that I don't think that March 2021 in particular was pegged. If it was, I missed that memo. But I think it was by that point in time, we had gotten our ducks in a row. We had our legal team, we had our academic committee that I'm a part of, and a good number of other just members that had signed on. We're an invite-only organization right now because we want to make sure that those who are choosing to be a part of the AFA really understand what it is that we exist to do. But we've got hundreds now that are members, and anybody can go to our website, see who the legal counsel is, see who the academic committee is, and who individual members, A through Z. You can look us up by last name and see who's a member.
So I guess, is there an instance, I guess, that you can talk about when the organization helped a professor in I guess, an employment dispute?
I can't, off the top of my head, tell you this was a key victory for us when we actually went to court and won a case. A number of those are still being litigated. One that I'm proud of, though, was the incident that happened at MIT, where you had a professor who's a distinguished professor known in terms of, I guess, interplanetary climate change issues. I believe he's a professor at Chicago. He was invited to give a prestigious lecture. It's an annual lecture at MIT. MIT uses this distinguished lecture as an outreach to encourage students to pursue STEM. Well, this particular professor co-wrote an article for, I believe, Newsweek magazine about something that had nothing to do with science. But he questioned the way current diversity, equity, and inclusion departments and measures were being implemented, across the country. And so he was expressing his private opinion. And because of that, some MIT faculty and alums complained, and his invitation was rescinded. Had nothing to do with the actual reason he was invited. He's a known expert. What the AFA decided to do was drew attention to this situation. Of course, MIT ignored that. And so what Robbie George decided to do under the auspices of the James Madison program, and he said, hey, come give your lecture at Princeton. And so we were proud of the fact that we were able to at least provide an alternative forum for this person to speak to his expertise. And it was also done by Zoom. So hundreds, if not thousands of people were able to watch the lecture. And so we thought that we made at least a little public splash in defense of First Amendment right to speak.
So I guess in the instance that you're talking about, though, this person's a public figure to a certain extent. And I assume, and tell me if this is wrong, I guess, but whatever article they wrote, I assume that the school they taught at was also mentioned in this article. And I understand your point of it's a personal political belief, but in some way, this person obviously was representing the school that he worked at, right?
No, if you're publishing, like I do editorials every now and then, and when you publish an editorial, your employer is mentioned simply to identify who you are. You are never speaking on behalf of the university. And so the reason why I identify myself as the John K. Boardman Jr., professor of politics, is so that it allows people who do not know me to go, he's talking about some subject. He's not just a private citizen, and there's nothing wrong with that. But this person is bringing a level of experience, training, and expertise to the subject. Now, in his case, he was speaking as an academic because he's a scientist. That didn't make him any more expert on diversity issues than someone who's trained in sociology or race matters from a historical or political perspective. But it made sense for people to know that not so much that he was an expert in a particular scientific discipline, but that he was a member of the American Academy and he was making an observation about the world within which he operated that was changing, in particular in response to what happened to George Floyd. And he thought, let's pause here and think through what might be earnestly being pursued, but perhaps in a way that actually might be undermining our fundamental mission as academicians.
Speaking of editorials, I guess you wrote a piece for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the daily paper in Richmond, Virginia, called "Why Should Lee Remain a Namesake of My University?" So I guess, can you talk about what was the process of you even wanting to write that and connecting with the paper to do that?
Well, as I guess a number of people know, Washington and Lee has two slaveholders as their namesakes: George Washington, the founder of our country, and a major contributor early on to the endowment of the university. We actually changed our name to Washington College at the time because of that donation. He donated canal shares whose dividends were contributing to our endowment. And then, of course, we were named later after the 5-year tenure as president of Robert E. Lee, the most famous Confederate general. So the year or two running up to that decision of our faculty, about 80% of the faculty voted to request or demand of the trustees to remove the name of Lee from the university. Again, this was part of the wave of greater sensitivity towards racial matters and symbolism after George Floyd. We actually now have an endowed scholarship named after George Floyd. So faculty, 80%, and I was not one of them, voted to tell the trustees to take the name of Lee off. After a year of study, the trustees chose by 80% as well not to remove the name of Lee. In my discussions with faculty at a faculty meeting and just through actually some podcasts and other venues, I explained that, look, I'm an expert on Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. I think Robert E. Lee is a traitor. However, I believe he was an instrumental administrator of a college, my college, that at the time had maybe 40, 50 boys going to it. And he raised sufficient funds north and south and drew students north and south, white students, unfortunately just white, but used, in my opinion, after the war, his reputation to get the South back on board, loyal to the Union, broadly speaking, and counseled them against guerrilla warfare, among other things. And so because of what he did as a president of my college, obviously not because he's the patron saint of the lost cause, I said, hey, I'm going to give you my personal and expert opinion about him as a Confederate who fought against the Union that Lincoln strove to preserve. I think he was a traitor. But on this matter of removing the name, I thought that it was the height of chutzpah for current faculty who had no problem drawing a paycheck for years from a university named after not just one, but two slaveholders, all of a sudden to decide that they're ashamed of going to a university that has Lee as its namesake. I wanted to point out why that was incorrect. I submitted that op-ed to the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, rejected by all of them. And for Virginia politics or even national politics, I go to a university that has a sufficient reputation that if I have a decent editorial, it'll probably get run by the Richmond Times-Dispatch. And they did.
So in terms of you, I guess, saying that, I guess it was kind of disingenuous of certain faculty at the school you teach at to all of a sudden kind of object to the name. I mean, prevailing thought changes, right? Like, is there no space for that to kind of develop over time?
I do, but the fact of the matter is they still draw their paychecks from Washington and Lee University. Have faculty left because they thought the administration or trustees were insufficiently sensitive to these issues? Yes, I know of at least two cases where that happened, but the lion's share of the people who voted for that name removal still teach at Washington and Lee University.
Some of the stuff that I found was that you, with your byline on it, was related to the 1619 project. And I don't want to say target. Is there a softer word for target? It seems like a piece of journalism or writing that a number of people with a specific kind of political point of view, I guess, or maybe in this case, academic point of view, have taken issue with. And at some point, toward the end of a story called "What Sean Willents Gets Wrong About Senator Tom Cotton and the American Founding," you refer to the 1619 riots. So can you, I guess, I don't know if that is a phrase, I guess, that you have coined or if it's from elsewhere, but can you kind of talk about that idea? Like what
Sure.
are the 1619 riots?
Well, as you know, in the wake of the George Floyd murder, homicide, however you want to characterize it, I know it's controversial, but in the wake of his death, certainly there were a number of demonstrations, a number of peaceful assemblies to protest what happened and to argue for change. And a number of those became violent. A number of those led to vandalism, destruction of public property, and even injuries and deaths. And so they went out of control. And the only way to describe them is as riots. A professor named Charles Kessler argued in an op-ed for, I believe, the New York Post, that it was appropriate to call these the 1619 riots because they seem to be driven by an understanding of the American founding as irredeemably racist. And anyone who was in support of the founding, including abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, their statues were being pulled down, as well as statues of, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Christopher Columbus, you name it. So how do we get to 1619 riots? Nicole Hannah-Jones, the curator of the 1619 Project that was produced in August of 2019 for the New York Times Magazine. She's a writer for them, an investigative reporter. Actually, after the George Floyd incident, she heard about this article and she tweeted. Oh, and by the way, somebody had written 1619 on one of these statues that was pulled down. And it was on placards that protesters were holding up. She heard that the riots were called 1619 riots. And she said, "Thanks. I feel honored by it." I forget the actual wording of it. You could look it up on Twitter. But she claimed that this was an honorific for her.
Let's get back to chatting with Professor Morel, but skip ahead a bit to just after he's made the point that mostly white elected officials accomplish civil and voting rights legislation, as well as the writing of the Massachusetts Constitution. which was adopted toward the end of the 18th century and gave rights to black citizens. I mean, we were talking about personally held beliefs. So, you can, advocate for the freedom of people, but still be biased against them. So I think what you're talking about is a legal remedy to an issue, but that doesn't necessarily solve social issues.
Don't you want to begin at the level of systems, at the level of structures, at the level of principles? In other words, if you don't even have that, how are you going to shape individual opinions? And so for me, I'm a black person in the state of Massachusetts. I am thankful that Constitution is written the way it is. And I am thankful that within years of the independence of that state, it led to my emancipation. If whites don't change their minds towards me, I'm at least glad the Constitution and laws are on my side. Let's start there.
Emancipation, though, wouldn't make a formerly enslaved person's life equivalent to, like, their ability to easily move through life equivalent to a white citizen of those places. But separately, you've referred to the Civil War as our greatest crisis of national identity. So how do the past several years compare to that? And how has this manifested itself, if at all, I guess, in classrooms that you've led?
Yeah, that's a great question. To restate the point that you summarized there, I described the years right before the 1860 presidential election and then the ensuing crisis that led to, secession and rebellion that led to a civil war. I described that as a crisis of American identity. We became confused about the meaning of America. And that election was pivotal precisely because there were different paths laid before a predominantly white population with regards to what the meaning of America is, what our citizens, regardless of color, owed by their federal government. And Lincoln and the Republicans presented an alternative, Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, an alternative, and then John Breckinridge and John Bell, other alternatives. Lincoln's was the only one, and there were a lot of racist Republicans. Okay, I'll just put that out there. But Lincoln and the Republican Party was the only one that gave the traditional reading of the Declaration of Independence. Stephen Douglas, after Lincoln was elected in December, on Christmas Eve, proposed 2 amendments to the Constitution. What would have been the 14th Amendment would have made white supremacy systemic, because it would say Black people could neither vote or hold political office at any political level in the United States: federal, state, territorial, local, municipal. That was an option, right? And then, of course, there was the Breckinridge Southern Democrat option that said slavery should be national. Okay? So that's a crisis of identity. What does America mean? What does the Constitution mean? How do we read that statement? All men are created equal. There were political differences of opinion. Are we there today? No. I don't think we're on the brink of a hot civil war. Some have called this a cold civil war. And I think, unfortunately, it kind of is. We are undergoing this cultural division or conflict, this struggle about how we understand ourselves as Americans. Good grief, the leaked Alito opinion in Dobbs. Isn't that putting people in opposing camps? Is there this constitutional right that the court has said since, 1973, to an abortion? That, relatively speaking, working with your doctor up until the actual birth? Or do we value the sanctity of the life of the unborn? There is a clear division among Americans. So in a broad respects, education, abortion, you name it, there is a clear division of this country, and it remains to be seen in the fall elections and in the presidential election of 2024, how our potential leaders, statesmen, can I say that? How they're going to mend that divide. Are they simply going to play to the base, or in a general election are going to campaign to the middle? I want to see whether members of either party can campaign to that middle and show us what we do share in common as people and as citizens.
I think there was kind of a mischaracterization of access to abortion there. But can you talk about how those ideas, I guess, manifest in the classroom?
In the classroom, what I have done, I teach a course each year, not just on Lincoln. I teach a course each year called Race and Equality. And I see our history, our American political constitutional development as a debate, a disagreement leading to some agreement over the meaning of equality, right? Is sex relevant? Is race relevant? Is ethnicity relevant? Is nation of origin relevant, et cetera? It's basically a class on the greatest hits of Black American political thought. This year, this past spring, winter, was the first time I included readings that discuss critical race theory. Okay. And so what I've been doing in my classroom is trying to teach my students, when you form an opinion, make it a fair fight. In other words, don't set up straw men that are easy to knock down. Honestly, wow, if you're doing that, how secure are you in your own opinions? Yikes. And so we take a day to read from critical race theorists, and then we take a day to discuss their critics. We do the same for Black Power. We do the same for Martin Luther King Jr. My goodness, there are things in King's writings that I believe deserve scrutiny and even criticism.
So this is the last question I'll ask, and it is something that I ask everyone who comes on the show. Is there an interaction with a teacher or mentor that kind of sticks out in your mind?
William Barclay Allen, who is now emeritus from, he used to be the head of the Michigan State University's James Madison College for a master's program. He was my professor when I was an undergrad at Harvey Mudd College, when I still thought I was a mechanical engineering major. But he was the politics professor there. He assigned the Declaration of Independence. What did I know of the Declaration? I learned from my high school social studies professor that it was simply a propaganda sheet. I'm like, ooh, that sounds really cool. So when Bill Allen read a portion of the Declaration of Independence, which he had assigned for us to read, I'm guessing I didn't read it. I had a sophisticated answer about what it meant. I raised my hand, said this thing about propaganda sheet, and I sat back contented with myself. Professor Allen looked at me, and I remember this as if it was this morning. He said, "Mr. Morel, have you ever read the Declaration of Independence?" Full stop. That was his way of saying, I trust you with this text. I'm not going to replace your ignorance with my assumed expertise. Why don't you and I and your peers engage the text? Why don't we read this thing for ourselves and see if there's an argument here? And then let's weigh that argument. Let's weigh it, sift it, consider it. He said, the texts are our teachers. And I hope, after 30 years of teaching at college full-time on my own, that I have come at least half the way towards doing this, teaching my students to read with care, to read closely, and then to discuss with others what's in front of them.
That's all we've got for this edition of the show. I'm the host and producer of The Best of Our Knowledge, Dave Cantor. And just a reminder that the views expressed by the guests of the show are solely their own. They do not reflect the views of the host, the station, or its management. That said, you can find The Best of Our Knowledge online at WAMC.org and on just about any app you can think of: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Pocket Casts. So go ahead, subscribe, and join us next week for another edition of The Best of Our Knowledge.